The street was alive with noise that evening, car horns echoing and voices rising from the sidewalks as people hurried home. In the middle of it all sat a man behind the wheel of a faded yellow taxi, his hands resting calmly on the steering. To anyone who glanced inside, he was just another driver waiting for passengers. His shirt was a little worn, his cap pulled low, his eyes hidden in shadows. Nobody paid him a second look. But if you looked closer, you would notice something different about him. His eyes weren't the tired eyes of a man beaten down by life. They carried something sharper, a spark that didn't belong in the everyday struggle. His name was Cunnel, and though the world saw him as an ordinary taxi driver, he was anything but ordinary. On that day, a group of students rushed toward his car, laughing loudly as they pushed one another to get in. They bargained over the fare, and one even teased him for charging too high. He smiled faintly, not arguing, just nodding and starting the engine. To them, he was just another man trying to make ends meet. But deep down, Cunnel's mind was far from the noisy streets. He was remembering faces, names, deals made in secret places, and a world nobody around him would ever imagine he belonged to. As the taxi rolled along, one of the students leaned forward, curious. "Barber driver, how long you don day do this work?" he asked with a grin. Cunnel's voice was soft, almost quiet. "Long enough," he replied, his eyes fixed on the road. They laughed and turned back to their chatter, not realizing the truth hidden in his words. The truth that he wasn't meant to be behind the wheel at all. Later that night, after dropping off his passengers, Cunnel parked by the roadside near a quiet corner of Lagos. He pulled out an old phone, the kind nobody would pay attention to. His fingers moved quickly, dialing a number that wasn't stored in his contacts. It rang once and stopped. That was enough. Somewhere, someone else had received a signal. Cunnel leaned back in his seat, breathing slowly. He had chosen this disguise for a reason. For months, he had lived like this, hiding in plain sight. Every passenger who stepped into his taxi thought they were dealing with a simple man, but he carried a secret worth more than all their laughter and coins. The night grew darker, and the city never truly slept. Yet inside his taxi, Cunnel sat still, watching people walk past. He knew the day was coming when the truth would break free. The truth that would shock not just the people who looked down on him but an entire nation. What nobody around him knew was that Cunnel was tied to something massive, something that stretched far beyond the reach of the noisy streets. And while he wore the face of a driver, the real man beneath was worth billions. The following morning, Cunnel's taxi rolled out from a narrow street before the sun was fully awake. Lagos was already alive with movement, hawkers calling out prices, conductors hanging off the side of buses, voices rising and clashing like an orchestra nobody had rehearsed for. Cunnel sat in the middle of it all, steady, unshaken, as though the chaos bent around him. To anyone watching, he was just a man hustling for the day's bread, nothing more. A young woman waved him down. Her hair was tied back neatly, her handbag clutched close to her chest. She slid into the back seat and sighed like she was carrying the weight of the world. Cunnel adjusted the mirror slightly, enough to see her face without being noticed. Her name was Amora, though she didn't introduce herself. She gave him an address in Ikoyi, her tone sharp, like someone who was used to people obeying. On the way, Amora scrolled through her phone, complaining under her breath about a failed deal, about greedy business partners who thought they could cheat her family company. She never once looked at the man driving her. To her, he was invisible. Just another taxi driver. But Cunnel's ears were sharp. He caught every word, every name she muttered in anger. He stored them quietly, filing the details in the hidden compartments of his mind. When they got to her stop, she paid him without looking up, already on another call. Cunnel watched her walk into a tall building with glass walls that reflected the rising sun. He smiled faintly, not because of her rudeness but because he knew her world would soon brush against his in ways she couldn't imagine. By midday, his taxi had carried schoolchildren, traders, a tired nurse heading home after night shift, and an older man who spent the whole ride talking about how Nigeria had changed. Cunnel listened, responding only when necessary, always calm, always watching. To everyone else, it was just a ride. But for Connell, every ride was information. Every face, every conversation, every stop meant something. He was weaving a net nobody else could see. That evening, as traffic slowed to a crawl, a sleek black SUV pulled up beside his taxi. The windows were tinted, but Connell felt the weight of eyes on him. The SUV didn't move forward, even when the road cleared a little. Connell kept his gaze on the steering wheel, his heartbeat steady. He knew who they were. They were watching him. When the traffic finally moved, the SUV took a different turn, but Connell knew it wasn't random. He had been marked. And yet, he kept driving, dropping off passengers as though nothing had changed. Later that night, he didn't go home. Instead, he parked in front of a small roadside shop that sold roasted corn. The woman running it greeted him warmly. "Driver, go tire. Every day NA work, work, work." He smiled, bought 2 pieces of corn, and leaned against his taxi, chewing slowly. Around him, the night was alive with voices, but inside his mind, he was drawing maps of names, places, and threats. The number he had dialed the night before wasn't just a random call. It was a signal to men who moved in silence, men who were waiting for him to decide when to strike. Hours later, when the streets were quieter, Connell opened the glove box of his taxi. Inside, beneath old papers and a faded torchlight, lay a sleek black envelope sealed with a red wax mark. He touched it lightly, almost reverently, before closing the box again. That envelope carried secrets powerful enough to shake boardrooms, topple companies, and redraw fortunes. It was why he lived in disguise. To everyone else, Connell was just a driver trying to survive the city's endless grind. But the truth was bigger. He wasn't just hiding from the world. He was waiting. And while Lagos carried on as if nothing unusual was happening, the man behind the wheel of the yellow taxi was carrying a destiny worth billions. One that was slowly, surely, coming closer to being revealed. Night crept over the city like a heavy curtain, and Connell drove his taxi into the quieter parts of Lagos where the noise of danfos and impatient drivers faded into the background. His headlights carved through the darkness, bouncing off broken walls and rusted gates. Most people thought this was when drivers went home to sleep, but for Connell, this was when his real work began. He parked by a narrow alley, cut the engine, and waited. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant hum of a generator. Then, a shadow emerged, moving with careful steps. A tall man in a simple shirt approached the taxi, tapped twice on the roof, and slid into the passenger seat. His face was stern, but his voice was low. "They've started watching you," the man said. Connell nodded, not surprised. "I saw them today," he replied softly. "Black SUV. Tinted glass." The man grunted. "You know what that means. They're closing in." Connell's hand rested on the steering wheel. "Let them come," he said. "I've been hiding long enough." The man pulled out a small brown envelope and placed it on the dashboard. "This is the last piece of the puzzle. Once you decide, there's no going back." Connell glanced at it, then back at the road ahead. His face gave nothing away, but inside his chest, his heart carried the weight of choices. He wasn't just living as a taxi driver to stay safe. He was gathering strength, waiting for the exact moment when his true identity would strike like lightning. The man left as quietly as he had arrived, disappearing into the darkness. Connell remained seated for a long time, staring at the brown envelope without opening it. Finally, he tucked it into the glove compartment, right next to the black envelope already waiting there. 2 secrets, side by side, like fire and fuel. The next morning, Connell went back to his routine. People waved him down, bargained over fares, filled his backseat with laughter and complaints. A group of market women argued over the price of tomatoes, their voices rising and falling like drums. A young boy pressed his face to the window, staring wide-eyed at the passing world. None of them knew they were sitting in the middle of something far bigger than a taxi ride. At one stop, a middle-aged businessman entered the car. His suit was sharp, his perfume strong, his voice dripping with arrogance. He barely greeted Connell before launching into a heated phone call. "These drivers are a menace," the man complained loudly, though Connell was just inches away. "Everywhere you turn, they block the road. No discipline, no ambition. Just poverty and noise." Connell drove in silence, his expression unreadable. He had heard words like these many times before, people dismissing him, looking down on him. What they didn't realize was that the very man they insulted had the power to destroy or rescue their fortunes with a single decision. When the man reached his stop, he tossed the fare onto the seat without a glance. Connell picked it up calmly, pocketed it, and drove on. By evening, he was back in Ikoyi, the same street where Amora had entered his car the day before. This time, she wasn't alone. She stood outside with two men in suits, their conversation sharp and tense. Connell slowed just enough to catch fragments of their words. "The contract, billions on the line. We can't afford leaks." Connell's grip on the steering wheel tightened. That word, billions, echoed in his ears. He knew these weren't just business negotiations. This was the kind of money and power that could alter destinies. He drove away before they noticed him, but the pieces in his mind began to click into place. The students from the other day, the names Amora had muttered, the arrogance of the businessman, the black SUV watching from a distance, all of it was connected. The city thought Connell was driving aimlessly, but in truth, he was tracing a map, a pattern hidden in everyday moments. That night, he didn't go to the roasted corn woman. Instead, he drove toward the water, where the lagoon reflected the city lights like shattered glass. He parked, stepped out, and let the wind brush against his face. For a moment, he felt the weight of everything pressing down on him. The life he had chosen, the disguise he wore, the secrets locked inside those envelopes. He whispered to himself, "Soon." Because he knew the truth could not stay hidden forever. And when it finally came out, those who laughed at the poor taxi driver would see that they had been sitting next to a man worth more than the fortunes they guarded so proudly. Connell climbed back into his taxi, started the engine, and melted once again into the night. But the storm was getting closer. And when it broke, the city of Lagos would never be the same. Morning returned with a fiery sky, and Lagos moved with its usual impatience. Connell's yellow taxi weaved through traffic like it belonged to the rhythm of the streets. Children in uniforms waved as they passed, hawkers stretched out bottles of water through car windows, and policemen shouted at drivers who ignored signals. To anyone watching, this was just another day in the life of a taxi driver. But Connell knew different. Every hour he stayed in disguise was one step closer to a revelation that would shake everything around him. That day, his first passenger was an old woman with a wrapper tied firmly around her waist and a basket balanced carefully in her arms. She entered the taxi slowly, her eyes weary but her voice firm. "Driver, take me to Soyulir," she said. As the taxi moved, she began to talk, not about herself but about the country, about leaders who had forgotten their people, about how ordinary men were the ones carrying the weight of everything. Connell listened quietly, his hand steady on the wheel. Her words felt like echoes of thoughts he carried inside him every night. She didn't know who she was speaking to. She only saw a man in a taxi. But her words were feeding his resolve, pushing him closer to what he had been waiting for. Later in the day, Connell picked up a young man in a rumpled shirt who looked like he hadn't slept in days. The man was eager to talk. "I've got an interview," he said nervously, clutching a folder. "If I get this job, maybe I can finally help my family. They've been waiting too long." Connell gave him a brief nod, keeping his tone calm. "You'll get there," he said, and the young man smiled faintly, perhaps drawing strength from the quiet assurance in the driver's voice. As he dropped the young man off, Connell noticed the same black SUV parked across the road. The tinted windows gave away nothing, but Connell didn't need to see faces to know who was inside. They weren't just watching anymore, they were following him. He kept his cool. He didn't accelerate or try to escape. He drove like every other taxi driver on the road, stopping for passengers, making small turns, blending into the crowd. The SUV tailed him for nearly an hour before disappearing into the sea of traffic. Connell knew this was only the beginning. That evening, Amora entered his taxi again, this time alone. Her phone call was brief, her tone sharp. But when she hung up, she slumped against the seat and let out a long sigh. For the first time, Connell saw her vulnerability. She wasn't just a confident businesswoman. She was someone drowning in responsibilities she couldn't share. "You look tired," Connell said, his voice steady. She glanced at him, surprised that he spoke. Then she gave a small, bitter laugh. "Tired is an understatement. Everyone wants something. Everyone is pretending. I don't even know who to trust anymore." Connell didn't respond. He let the silence hang, giving her the rare gift of not asking questions. When he dropped her off, she paused, studying his face. For the first time, she didn't look at him as just a driver. There was something in his calmness that unsettled her. That night, Connell drove to a quiet compound on the edge of Yaba. The gate opened after 2 knocks, and he entered, parking his taxi behind tall walls. Inside, a small group of men sat waiting around a wooden table. They weren't ordinary men. Their eyes were sharp, their words measured. Connell took a seat, placing both envelopes on the table. The men leaned forward, their expressions tightening as they realized what he had brought. Inside those envelopes were documents, numbers, contracts, and signatures, the kind of secrets that could make or break empires. One of the men whispered, "If this goes public, everything changes. Companies will fall. Families will lose power. Billions will shift hands." Connell leaned back, his voice calm. "That's the point." The room went silent. Every man present knew they were sitting with someone who had been underestimated for too long. Someone who had chosen the disguise of a taxi driver not out of weakness but as a shield. After the meeting, Connell returned to his taxi. The city lights flickered in the distance, and the night air carried the sound of generators and laughter from nearby streets. He sat quietly in the driver's seat, staring at the wheel that had been his mask for months. He whispered again, "Soon." But this time, his voice carried more weight. The storm was no longer far away. It was already forming above the city, and when it finally broke, no one would forget the driver they had overlooked. Rain began to fall over Lagos that morning, the kind that pounded rooftops and turned narrow streets into flowing streams. Cars splashed through puddles, pedestrians lifted trousers and skirts as they ran for shelter, and umbrellas bloomed like flowers in the storm. Connell sat in his taxi, the wipers moving back and forth, his face calm as he watched the city bend to the weather. To him, the rain was not a disruption. It was a cover. And on that day, he needed it. His first passenger was a banker, a young man in a neat suit, clearly late for work. The man complained endlessly about the traffic, about the government, about the rain itself. He never once looked at Connell, never once noticed the way the driver's eyes shifted between the mirrors, tracking more than just cars. To the banker, this was just a taxi ride. But for Connell, the ride was part of something larger, another piece of his disguise, another moment to stay hidden in plain sight. After dropping him off, Connell drove toward the island. The rain had slowed, leaving behind a city washed clean but restless. On his way, he noticed the same black SUV again. This time, it didn't trail at a distance. It moved closer, too close. Connell kept his expression steady, but his mind sharpened. He turned into a side street, then another, pretending to follow shortcuts passengers often suggested. The SUV stayed with him until he reached a busy junction where Danfos, Okadas, and private cars clashed for space. In the chaos, the SUV disappeared. Connell parked at a small roadside shop where he often stopped for a kara and pap. The woman selling recognized him instantly. "Driver. Today rain no go let person rest oh," she said with a smile, handing him his food. Connell nodded politely, ate in silence, and kept one eye on the road. He knew his time of hiding was shortening. Every movement was being noticed now. By afternoon, Amora flagged his taxi again. She slid into the back seat with hurried steps, her voice sharp as she gave him another Ikoyi address. She was restless, tapping her phone against her palm. Halfway through the journey, she broke the silence. "You're always so quiet," she said suddenly, leaning forward. "Don't you ever get tired of this? Driving people around all day?" Kunal kept his eyes on the road. "Work is work," he replied calmly. She studied him for a moment, then gave a small laugh. "You're not like the others. I don't know why, but there's something about you." Her words lingered in the air, heavy with curiosity. But before Kunal could respond, her phone rang. She answered quickly, her voice dropping as she spoke. Kunal caught fragments, words like partnership, documents, and leak. His ears sharpened. She was closer to the storm than she realized. When he dropped her off, she hesitated again, looking at him as though she wanted to ask something. Instead, she paid and left quickly, disappearing into the tall glass building. Kunal sat for a moment, staring at the door she had entered, before driving away. That night, Kunal did not return home. Instead, he parked his taxi in a dimly lit compound where the same group of men from Yaba waited. They sat around the table again, the air thick with tension. One of them spoke first. "We've confirmed it. The companies involved are laundering money through contracts. Billions. And the families protecting them, they'll do anything to keep it hidden." Another man added, "That's why they're following you. They know you have the files." Kunal placed the black and brown envelopes on the table. His voice was low but firm. "It's almost time. But we can't rush. If this goes out wrong, it will vanish. They will bury it. We need the right moment." The men nodded. They respected his patience. They knew Kunal wasn't just a man holding secrets, he was the strategist, the one who had been living in the shadows long enough to understand timing. When the meeting ended, Kunal returned to his taxi. He sat in the silence, staring at his reflection in the mirror. The face that stared back was one Lagos had ignored, dismissed, insulted, and underestimated. But behind it was a truth larger than any insult. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. A single message flashed on the screen. "They know who you are." Kunal's eyes narrowed. He locked the phone, started the engine, and merged back into the restless city. He was no longer just waiting. The storm had moved closer, and soon, the city that saw him as nothing more than a taxi driver would discover the man they had overlooked was worth more than they could ever imagine. And this time, there would be no hiding. The city woke restless that morning. The rain had cleared, but the ground still held puddles, and the air smelled of damp earth mixed with exhaust fumes. Lagos moved with its usual impatience, horns blaring, hawkers chasing after buses, voices rising like competing drums. Kunal sat behind the wheel of his taxi, eyes calm, mind sharp. To everyone else, he was still just another driver waiting for fares. But deep inside, he knew the disguise was cracking. His secret was no longer safe. He picked up his first passenger, a secondary school teacher carrying a bag of worn-out books. She spoke about her students, how some came to class without food, how others worked after school just to survive. She sighed deeply, saying, "Nigeria no easy, my brother." Kunal responded only with a small nod, but her words stung him. He wasn't just listening as a driver. He was listening as a man who had the means to change everything but was forced, for now, to remain in the shadows. As the day unfolded, Kunal noticed the black SUV again. This time it didn't trail at a distance. It drove up beside him at a traffic stop. The tinted glass lowered halfway, revealing a pair of eyes that studied him carefully. Then the glass went back up, and the SUV drove off. Kunal's grip on the steering wheel tightened. The message was clear, they weren't hiding anymore. Later that afternoon, Amora entered his taxi once more. Her steps were hurried, her face troubled. She didn't give an address this time, only said, "Just drive." Kunal started the engine, pulling into traffic without a word. For a long stretch, she stayed quiet, staring out the window. Then, Almost in a whisper, she said, "Do you ever feel like people are keeping secrets from you? Like everyone around you is hiding something?" Connell kept his eyes on the road, his voice steady. "Sometimes. But secrets always find their way out." She turned sharply toward him, studying his profile. "You talk like someone who knows." Connell didn't answer. He let the silence swallow her suspicion. But inside, he knew their worlds were drawing closer. Amora was standing at the edge of the same storm he had been living in. She just didn't know it yet. That evening, the storm revealed itself fully. Connell drove into a narrow street where he often parked to rest. Before he could switch off the engine, two men appeared, blocking the front of his taxi. Another approached from behind. They weren't ordinary thugs, their movements were too precise, too professional. One tapped on his window, signaling for him to step out. Connell opened the door slowly, his expression calm. The man closest to him said, "You've been carrying something that doesn't belong to you." Connell looked at him, unshaken. "It belongs to the people," he said. The man smirked. "Not everything belongs to the people. Sometimes it belongs to those strong enough to keep it." Before the conversation could continue, a noise erupted from the other end of the street. Shouts, footsteps, the sound of people approaching quickly. The men glanced at each other, then retreated into a waiting car. In seconds, they were gone, swallowed by the night. Connell stood still for a moment, the weight of what had just happened pressing on him. They were no longer satisfied with watching. They were ready to take him. Later that night, he met again with the group in Yaba. The room was tense, the air heavy. One of the men slammed his fist against the table. "They're moving fast. If we don't act, everything will disappear. They will crush us." Another argued, "We can't rush. If we expose the documents too early, they'll find a way to bury it. We need to protect Connell first." All eyes turned to him. Connell leaned forward, his face calm but his voice sharp. "This isn't about me. It's about truth. They want to silence me because they know once this comes out, their empire is finished." The men exchanged uneasy glances, but none of them doubted him. Connell wasn't just carrying secrets, he was carrying proof. And proof was more dangerous than any weapon. After the meeting, Connell returned to his taxi. He sat for a long time, staring at the steering wheel, his reflection faint in the windshield. He remembered every insult, every dismissive glance, every time someone tossed money at him without looking at his face. They had seen only a driver. But the truth was waiting to roar. His phone buzzed again. Another message, short and sharp. "Tomorrow. Be ready." Connell locked the phone, leaned back in his seat, and let out a long breath. The city around him didn't know it yet, but tomorrow would be the beginning of something it could never forget. The driver they had overlooked was no longer just waiting in the shadows. He was stepping into the light, carrying a truth worth billions, a truth strong enough to shake Nigeria to its core. The morning broke over Lagos with a strange quiet. The usual roar of traffic seemed muted, the honks and shouts held back by an invisible tension in the air. Connell's taxi moved steadily through the streets, his hands relaxed on the wheel but his mind alert. Today would not be like any other day. Today, the truth would step out of the shadows he had hidden in for so long. He picked up his first passenger, a young girl clutching a notebook, her eyes bright but filled with worry. She didn't speak at first, only staring out the window as the taxi jostled along the uneven streets. Connell broke the silence gently. "You look nervous. First day at the new school." She turned to him, startled by the voice. "Yes," she said softly. I don't know anyone there." Connell smiled faintly. "You'll find someone. Just be yourself." Her eyes lingered on him for a moment, sensing a calm they didn't know they needed. When she left, Connell drove on, the streets thick with people rushing about their business, unaware that the man behind the wheel of a simple yellow taxi was about to change more than their daily routine. By midday, the black SUV appeared again, cruising the roads near his route but never closing in. It was a warning, a reminder that the world he had hidden from was finally aware of him. Kunnal didn't panic. He had prepared for this day longer than anyone could imagine. Amora entered the taxi one last time. Her eyes were sharp, her movements brisk. She didn't give an address. "Drive," she said, almost a command, as if she too had sensed that the day was different. Kunnal obeyed silently, weaving through traffic, keeping the SUV in his peripheral vision. Slowly, he spoke, breaking the tension. "You're close to something dangerous, you know." Amora's brow furrowed. "Danger? What are you talking about?" He didn't answer immediately. He let the streets speak, the city itself telling him when the time was right. And when they reached a quieter part of Ikoyi, he finally spoke. "All this you're chasing, the contracts, the deals, the money you think you control, it's bigger than you know. And there are people willing to destroy anyone in their way." Her eyes widened. "Who are you?" Kunnal glanced at her briefly. "A driver, maybe. But not just that." He reached into the glove compartment and pulled out the black envelope, then the brown one. He placed them carefully on the seat between them. Her eyes followed his movements, disbelief spreading across her face. "These," he said, "hold everything. Every secret they've tried to hide. Every lie they've told. Billions are tied up in what's inside. And everyone who thought I was just a taxi driver, they were wrong." Amora reached for the envelopes, hands trembling slightly. She turned the first one over, then the second, scanning the documents inside. Her eyes grew wider with every page she turned. The realization hit her like a wave. Kunnal started the engine. "You need to understand," he said. "This is more than business. This is survival. Once this goes public, there's no turning back. Everyone who underestimated me will feel the consequences." The black SUV appeared again, closer this time, edging toward them on the road. Kunnal's calm didn't falter. He drove steadily, keeping his passengers safe, while simultaneously calculating every possible move. He knew they could try to stop him. They could try to take the envelopes. But they had underestimated him for too long. He finally turned down a quiet street, away from prying eyes. Amora looked at him, her voice trembling. You're worth billions." Kunnal smiled faintly, his eyes reflecting years of patience and planning. "Worth more than anyone imagined," he said. The SUV slowed at the corner, watching, waiting. But Kunnal didn't panic. He had led them into the open, where truth had the power. When he reached the meeting place, the men from Yaba were already there, waiting with security and arrangements carefully planned. Kunnal handed over the envelopes. The room fell silent as the documents were laid out. Each signature, each number, each page revealed the magnitude of what had been hidden. Amora stood in the corner, stunned. She realized that the quiet taxi driver she had ignored, the one everyone had overlooked, was not only untouchable in his mind but untouchable in reality. Kunnal spoke to the room calmly, but every word carried weight. "The world has been blind to the truth for too long. Today, we show them what has been hidden. Today, the driver they ignored becomes the one they cannot forget." The room erupted into quiet determination. Plans were made, strategies formed, and the envelopes were secured. Outside, Lagos went on, unaware that its ordinary streets had carried a man who held power greater than kings. Later that night, Kunnal returned to his taxi. He sat behind the wheel, staring at the city lights. 4 years, he had waited, hidden in plain sight, underestimated by everyone. And now, finally, the world knew, or would soon learn, the truth. He whispered into the night, voice steady but full of triumph. "They thought I was nothing. But I was everything all along." And in the heart of Lagos, under the quiet hum of electricity and distant car horns, a taxi driver had become more than a driver. He had become a force no one could ignore, a man whose patience, intelligence, and courage were worth billions, and whose story would never be forgotten. The city might never see him the same way again, but Kunnal didn't need anyone's recognition. He had always known his value. And the storm he had carried inside for so long had finally broken. And that's the incredible journey of Cunnel, the man who looked like an ordinary taxi driver but carried a fortune and a secret powerful enough to change everything around him. Remember, sometimes the people you least expect are the ones holding the keys to the biggest surprises. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next mind-blowing tale. We'd also love to hear from you. Tell us in the comments the country you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Your story could be part of our next adventure. Stay curious, stay amazed, and always remember, the world is full of hidden surprises, sometimes right under our noses.